passage from today comes from the book of Exodus. Moses was a reluctant leader. God called him to lead the people of God from slavery in Egypt, and yet Moses hesitated. Moses stalled. He made excuses. This story of liberation is an odd one for many reasons. God wanted to bring the people out of slavery, and yet time and time again the Bible says that God hardened the hearts of the Egyptians, of Pharaoh and others. Wouldn't it be easier to soften their hearts and let them go? There were plagues and mayhem that rained down on Egypt, and eventually the people of God were allowed to leave, or they escaped. And still, this must have been a terribly confusing time for them. They had been slaves for hundreds of years, and they were reluctant to leave, and now they were walking out free, but into the unknown. Where we pick up the story is where Pharaoh is changing his mind about having let the people go. And the Israelites find themselves trapped with a body of water closing their only escape route. The reading comes from Exodus 14. It begins in verses 5 and 7, then down to 10 to 14, and finally 21 to 29. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the minds of Pharaoh and the officials were changed towards the people. And they said, "What have we done? Letting Israel leave our service." So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him, and he took 600 picked chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians dancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong wind all night, and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord, in the pillar of fire and cloud, looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against us." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Whenever I read this Exodus story, I can't help but think of the 1956 movie, The Ten Commandments. Charlton Heston as Moses, right? Seems like that and Ben-Hur always got played around Easter somehow. I saw the Ten Commandments movie when I was a teenager on TV, and there is one scene in particular that I remember vividly, and it's this scene. Moses with his arms outstretched, and the waters of a massive sea being blown apart, and then creating an opening in the middle of the sea. And then the waters begin to become these walls, several stories high on the seabed, from the seabed, and then the people were able to walk through the sea on dry land. Now, it's Hollywood, of course. They know a good story when they see one. The special effects for the time were excellent, and the scene as a whole is just larger than life. The whole movie, that particular scene, just larger than life. That scene depicted, though, presents us with a number of challenges. To read the story in the Bible, or to picture it from that movie, makes one wonder, how did this happen? Or perhaps a more basic question, did this really happen? And those are fair questions, especially for people of faith who are seeking to understand God and understand God's message for us and God's action in the world. And as I've mentioned recently in a sermon, as a person of faith, the first lens I use to read the scriptures is to understand the Bible as a whole, as a love story between God and human beings. In the retelling of this particular scene, of this particular story, that descriptive language paints in words the feeling of survival against all odds, and the people seeing an impossible escape coming true. But even with a heart of faith, even with a mind ready to see this as part of a larger love story, one asks the hard, detailed questions. The questions of how. And so the first thing we encounter, if we delve into this, if we look at resources that talk about this particular passage in the Bible, we come to realize that there is no mention of this episode in ancient resources which were contemporary to when this was written in the scriptures. And that goes for really all of Exodus and Moses. Now that isn't the basis for dismissing the whole thing. For example, if something is recorded on a teenager's journal, but doesn't make it to the paper the next day, that is not reason to say that it didn't happen. The reason I say that is because there are some internal narrative details in the scriptures that point towards something really, really important happening. There are some names of people in the Exodus, among the Hebrew people, that are actually Egyptian names. Moses is one of them. And then there's another thing that it's hard to look at it. It's hard to see it when you just look at the passage like this, but there's actually 4 different versions, 4 different literary strands that are coming together to form what we now have as Exodus. And those 4 come from very different places, and yet somehow they weave in and out and create something that makes sense. So these internally let us know that something was there, something happened. That these are actual events, even if we have to then discern the poetic license of the retelling of the story. So if we go back to that crossing of the sea, there's a scholar that writes something, and I'll quote it just because it's easier that way. Historians frequently single out a reference to the action of God. They say, God who drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night. That's in the 21st verse of what we read. This can be understood as a storm-driven and tide-related recession of coastal waters, allowing passage of the Israelites, followed by a sudden return of the waters that engulfed the Egyptians. A variant of this view proposes that the receding waters exposed sandbars that people on foot could cross, but then people with horses or chariots would get bogged down. These reconstructions are more natural than the adjacent explanation of the deep waters then split to form a land bridge through the heart of the sea. But in spite of intense efforts to reconstruct the crossing, our evidence is far too scanty to do more than guess as to how natural and historical elements were combined in the events that underlie this important biblical tradition. There's another scholar that was saying that there might be also a connection to the poem that happens right after this passage in chapter 15. Because in there's this line. At the blast of God's nostrils, the waters piled up. The flood stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. So, with intellectual integrity, I would invite us to hold in tension the flowery storytelling of the ancients and the data-driven skepticism of us more moderns. And then I'm going to ask you to picture yourself in a situation where you felt that you were with your back against the wall. And when you turned to God in earnest prayer, asking for liberation, for healing, for safety. Maybe in the stress of the moment you were asking God for things to go back to the way they used to be, the way they were before, which is what the Israelites were asking ultimately. To go back to the time before the diagnosis came. To go back to the time before that big life-changing event came. To go back to before, just before. We may have asked not so much for a way through, but for a way back. Only going back didn't necessarily mean a good thing. The people blasted Moses. And they said that they regretted coming out. They regretted coming out to the desert. Why did you bring us out here? To kill us? Honestly, I'd rather live in slavery than face a violent death, these chariots and these soldiers coming at us. Good old Egypt isn't looking so bad right now. So they were with their backs against the sea, with an incompetent leader, with an army, an enemy army bearing upon them, and the Israelites just folded. They're backsliding. They wanted to wave a white flag, return to Egypt, take their punishment, and hope for the best. But God had something else in mind. A way through, an epic way through. And this is the only time that the poetic language of the crossing makes sense to me. The way through was down on the dry seabed, and they could almost touch the scary threat miraculously being held back, reaching out as if to walls of water ready to collapse in on them. We probably all have gone through moments when we felt like we were walking on dry ground, but we were touching wet walls all along the journey of that wall holding back the impending disaster. Of course, we like our stories to have a happy ending. We like to fast forward, so we picture the successful medical procedure, or the return of the prodigal, or the 11th hour job offer. But in that backs to the wall moment, when we were anguished and vacillating and wondering, that's when God asks us to do the crazy thing. To walk down a terrifying path with disaster ready to pounce on us. And we may have hesitated. We may have wondered if we could just plead with our oppressors, or with our tumor, or with our circumstances, anything, just to ask for a reprieve, something different. Or to follow God down the crazy path. Moses tried again and again to tell the Israelites, God did not bring you this far to desert you. The path we're on goes forward. In my years of ministry, there have been moments of uncertainty about what God wanted next from me. There were crises, there were jobs ending. Now, I pray, don't get me wrong. I'm not the prayer warrior that some of my Korean ministers and church members are, who are up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning praying every day. I only wish. But I do pray. I counsel with Tracy, with my colleagues, with my mom, my dad. Those are prayers too. And eventually, I landed on a prayer that has helped me greatly. Not because it solved the problems, but because it placed me, I think, more in God's hands, more fully, more willing to really let myself be in God's hands. And here it is, it's simple. I think you can remember. Lord, give me clarity and give me courage. Here's what I mean. Just give me clarity. Just open one door. This is not let's make a deal. I don't want to guess. I don't want to look at 3 doors and wonder whether there's a zonk behind 2. Don't leave me wondering. Just open the door you want for me. I will trust that is the door you want for me. But then give me courage, because no matter which door you open, I am certain to need the courage to go through it, even if it's the best possible outcome I could have dreamt of. Because remember, with our backs against the wall, with that fight or flight volume way cranked up, it takes courage to take that next step. We need to remember that God didn't bring us this far just to desert us. God offers us a way through, knowing we are able to make the journey. It does take faith and it does take courage, but the good news is that God provides it. It's not like God shows us the way and says, see you on the other side, good luck. Even so, as we know from experience, through how we know God, even when we know God is right there beside us, there is difficulty ahead. There are difficult experiences. We know that there might be pain and puzzling moments in that journey. The ground may be dry, but the walls will feel wet. Taking that crazy route God shows us, with trouble gaining on us, this disaster barely holding back, we keep our head down and we trust that God's way through is better than trying to make our way back. Thanks be to God for God's word for us. Amen.